In October 1941, German soldiers stood just miles from Moscow. They could almost see the spires of the Soviet capital through the cold autumn haze. After months of unstoppable victories across Europe, after crushing Poland, France, and pushing deep into Soviet territory, the Nazi war machine seemed unstoppable. Hitler believed one final strike would end the war in the East before winter arrived. But what happened next would shock the world. Snow began to fall, engines froze, guns jammed, and the army that had conquered half of Europe suddenly found itself fighting for survival. This is the story of Moscow 1941, the winter that changed World War II. Before we go deeper, if you enjoy clear, powerful World War II storytelling, make sure to like this video and subscribe to History Plus. It really helps the channel grow, and it tells me you want more detailed stories like this one. Now let's step into one of the most dramatic turning points of the entire war. In June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. More than 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union. Thousands of tanks rolled forward. Aircraft filled the skies. The plan was simple and bold: destroy the Red Army quickly, capture major cities, and force the Soviet Union to collapse before winter. At first, everything went according to plan. German forces advanced at incredible speed. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded and captured. Cities fell one after another: Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or taken prisoner in the first months. Many German officers believed victory was only weeks away, but the Soviet Union was not France. It was vast. Distances were enormous. Roads were poor. Supplies had to travel hundreds of miles from Germany to the front lines. Trucks broke down. Horses died from exhaustion. Fuel shortages began to appear. By September, German forces had already been fighting for 3 months. Casualties were high. Equipment was worn out. Yet Hitler made a critical decision. Instead of focusing everything on Moscow immediately, he divided his forces. Some units were sent south toward Ukraine. Others moved north toward Leningrad. Moscow would have to wait. This delay would matter. When the final push toward Moscow finally began in October 1941, it was called Operation Typhoon. The goal was clear: encircle the Soviet capital and end the war before winter. At first, the attack was successful. German armored units broke through Soviet defenses. Large pockets of red. Army troops were surrounded again, but then the weather changed. Autumn rains turned dirt roads into deep mud. This season was known in Russia as the Rasputitsa. Tanks became stuck. Trucks sank into the earth. Horses struggled to move artillery. Soldiers marched through mud that swallowed their boots. What had once been a fast, mobile war slowed to a crawl. Still, German commanders believed they could reach Moscow before the real cold arrived. They pushed forward with everything they had left. Soviet defenses stiffened as they approached the capital. Moscow was not just another city. It was the political heart of the Soviet Union. If it fell, morale could collapse. Inside the city, civilians were mobilized. Men and women dug anti-tank ditches. Factories were dismantled and moved east, piece by piece, so they could continue producing weapons far from German bombers. Soldiers prepared defensive lines. The entire nation understood what was at stake. By November, German advance units were within sight of Moscow's outer suburbs. Some soldiers later said they could see the city's skyline through binoculars, but they were exhausted. Temperatures began to drop below freezing. And this was only the beginning. German troops had not been issued proper winter clothing. Many believed the campaign would end before winter came. As temperatures fell to -20 and even -30 degrees Fahrenheit, weapons malfunctioned. Oil. Inside engines thickened and froze. Rifles had to be kept under coats to prevent metal parts from locking. Frostbite cases increased daily. Soldiers wrapped rags around their boots. Some units burned furniture from abandoned villages just to stay warm. The cold did not care about strategy or ideology. It attacked everyone equally. At the same time, the Soviet High Command was preparing something decisive. Intelligence reports suggested that Japan would not attack Siberia in the east. That meant Soviet divisions stationed there could be moved west to defend Moscow. These troops were trained for winter warfare. They had white camouflage uniforms. They had experience fighting in extreme cold. In early December 1941, as German forces made one last desperate push toward Moscow, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive. Fresh Siberian divisions attacked through snow-covered forests. Soviet tanks, especially the T-34, performed better in winter conditions than many German vehicles. The balance began to shift. German units that had been attacking for months suddenly found themselves defending against powerful new assaults. The shock was enormous. For the first time in the war, German forces were pushed back on a large scale. This was not a small tactical withdrawal. This was a clear strategic setback. Hitler reacted with anger. Some of his generals recommended pulling back to shorter defensive lines to save the army. Hitler refused. He ordered his troops to stand fast, no retreat. In some areas, this order prevented total collapse. In others, it increased suffering. Soldiers held positions in freezing conditions, often without proper shelter. Casualties rose. Morale was shaken. The myth of the unstoppable Blitzkrieg had been cracked. The winter around Moscow did not destroy the German army completely, but it proved something critical. Germany could be stopped. The Soviet Union would not collapse in 1941. The war in the East would not be short. It would become a long, brutal struggle of resources, endurance, and industrial power. And from this moment forward, everything changed. The soldiers who had marched confidently into the Soviet Union in June were now fighting to survive the cold. In December, the quick victory that Hitler promised was gone. In its place was a grinding war that would consume millions more lives. On History Plus, we focus not just on events, but on turning points. And Moscow in the winter of 1941 was exactly that, a turning point that reshaped the entire war. But this was only the beginning of the story. The winter had stopped the advance. What came next would determine whether Germany could recover, or whether the tide had permanently turned. When the Soviet counteroffensive pushed the Germans back from Moscow in December 1941, it was more than a battlefield setback. It was a psychological earthquake. For months, German propaganda had promised unstoppable victory. Now, for the first time, that image was shattered. Soldiers who had marched forward without fear were now digging defensive positions in frozen ground, unsure of what would come next. The Red Army did not simply push the Germans a few miles. In some sectors, they forced them back over 100 miles from Moscow. Entire German divisions were weakened, exhausted, and dangerously exposed. Supply lines that were already stretched thin became even more fragile as the front shifted westward in chaos. Hitler responded by tightening his control over the army. He dismissed several generals who suggested organized withdrawals. He believed that holding ground at any cost was the only way to prevent collapse. In some areas, this stubborn order kept units from breaking apart. In others, it led to unnecessary losses. German soldiers endured freezing temperatures with little relief, holding positions in forests and ruined villages while Soviet attacks continued through the winter. Meanwhile, something even more important was happening behind the lines. The Soviet Union was rebuilding. Factories that had been moved east beyond the Ural Mountains were already producing tanks, artillery, and ammunition in massive numbers. The famous T-34 tank, simple and effective, rolled off assembly lines faster than Germany could destroy it. What Germany saw as a wounded enemy was quietly becoming stronger. By the spring of 1942, the front had stabilized. Germany had not been destroyed, but it had lost the chance for a quick victory. The idea of ending the war in a single campaign was gone. Now the conflict would depend on endurance, resources, and long-term strategy. The winter of 1941 had not ended the war, but it had changed its direction. And as both sides prepared for the next summer, the question was no longer whether Germany could win quickly. The question was whether it could win at all. As the snow began to melt in early 1942, the battlefield looked different, but the danger had not disappeared. The German army had survived the winter, but it was wounded. Thousands of vehicles were lost. Equipment was worn down. Soldiers were physically and mentally exhausted. Yet Hitler. By late 1942 and into 1943, it became clear that Moscow had been more than just a failed offensive. It was the moment the illusion broke. Germany had entered the Soviet Union expecting a short campaign. Instead, it found itself locked in a war of survival against a nation that refused to collapse. After the winter of 1941, German strategy shifted south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. That decision led to another disaster at Stalingrad. But the roots of that disaster were planted outside Moscow. The failure to capture the Soviet capital meant the Red Army kept its command center, its rail networks, and its political heart intact. The Soviet government never fell. The industrial evacuation east continued without interruption. The war machine kept growing. The German army that attacked in 1942 was not the same army that crossed the border in 1941. It was still powerful, still dangerous, but no longer unstoppable. Losses from the Moscow campaign had weakened experienced units. Confidence had been shaken. And perhaps most important of all, time was no longer on Germany's side. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had learned hard lessons. Commanders improved coordination. Production increased. New waves of soldiers were trained and deployed. By the time Germany faced massive Soviet offensives in later years, the balance had shifted permanently. Moscow did not end the war. It did not destroy the German army overnight, but it forced a change in momentum that would never fully reverse. It proved that Blitzkrieg had limits. It showed that geography, climate, and industrial depth could overcome even the most aggressive invasion plan. When people ask what truly changed World War II, many point to later battles. But without the winter of 1941, those later victories might never have happened. Moscow was the first major crack in the foundation of the Nazi war machine. From that crack, everything else followed. On History Plus, we explore these turning points because they remind us that wars are not decided by confidence alone. They are decided by preparation, endurance, and the ability to adapt when plans fail. Now I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe Moscow was the true turning point, or do you think another battle mattered more? Share your opinion in the comments, and explain why. Your perspective makes this discussion stronger. If this story helped you understand how one brutal winter changed the course of history, share this video with someone who loves military history. And if you haven't already, subscribe to History Plus for more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world. The snow outside Moscow in 1941 did more than freeze engines and rifles. It froze an empire's dream of quick victory, and once that dream shattered, the path to Berlin had already begun.